Hello, everyone. Welcome to Something to Talk About Live. My name is Liz Owen. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm the Director of Communications at pflagnation.al. Great to have you with us for another conversation this week as part of Something to Talk About Live, and it's a good one today. As always, I'm joined by our host, my good friend and colleague, Jean Marie Navetta.
Liz Owen, hello.
Hello, Jean Marie Navetta. How are you?
I'm good. I'm really excited about today's conversation because, I'm a little bit of a data nerd, and any opportunity to pull polling apart makes me super excited.
Well, you are talking to the perfect person for this conversation.
Yes,
today.
I am. Well, we might see you later. And just as a reminder to everybody, if you have questions, you should definitely let us know in the chat because Liz is always watching those. Thank you, Liz.
My total pleasure. See you later.
Bye. Hey, everybody. My name is Jean Marie Navetta. I'm the Director of Learning and Inclusion at pflagnation.al, and my pronouns are she and her, or if you speak Spanish, ella. Every single week, we get together on Something to Talk About Live to talk about issues related to LGBT equality and inclusion. And as I sort of teased already, we are going to be talking about research and polling today, which is always interesting. But I do want to acknowledge that today, on July 14th, it is International Non-Binary Peoples Day. This commemoration was actually started in 2012 to raise awareness about non-binary identities and some of the challenges that people who are non-binary often face. So today we are going to be touching on that topic a little bit. For those of you who like reading the article every single week that we are using for our conversation, this week's article comes from Time Magazine. It was written by Belinda Luscombe, and it was entitled, "Public Opinion About Gender Identity is Increasingly Complex." And boy, is that ever true. So just to give you a little bit of an idea of what the article actually gets into, it is talking about some new research that came out of Pew. And there is new data on non-discrimination protections and opinions on that, levels of acceptance, which the answer is it depends on your age and probably your politics, about names and pronoun use, observations on the pace of change around trans and non-binary issues, questions about expansive options on forms, for example, and even the number of people who are connected to somebody who is trans or non-binary. So there's a lot of information in this, and this is coming on the heels of some earlier data that is establishing that there are actually more people who are trans and non-binary out there, especially as we start looking towards younger demographics. So as the title of this week's article says, it is increasingly complex. And when things are complex, you need really smart people to help simplify and pull it all apart and help us understand this information. And even more importantly, be able to act on some of the information. And of course, we are bringing somebody fabulous to you. So this week, we are bringing back one of our friends from the show, Heron Greenesmith, who is a senior research analyst at Political Research Associates. They are also an attorney, an educator, an author, and an advocate. And I'm just going to add, because we were talking about it, they have fabulous hair. So I am going to bring in Heron now. There you are with the reveal.
I did it.
You did it. I love it. I love that you're just sort of pushing the envelope in subtle ways.
That's right. That's me all the time.
You're so subversive.
A maverick, a renegade. Subversive.
So thank you for coming back and talking to us, especially about this, because I'm, as you can tell, a little bit hyper about it. But before we go anywhere, I want to make sure that people know what Political Research Associates does. So could you just tell people, because your work is so good, and I feel like everyone should know to go to the website and especially look at your anti-LGBT organizing work too.
Yes, absolutely. So Political Research Associates is 40 years old this year. We were founded by a queer woman, Jean Hardesty. Please look her up. She and her legacy are absolutely incredible. We were founded by her and some colleagues in the middle of the country, or maybe on the West Coast, I can't actually remember, researching fascists and, just doing that underground work during the rise of the Reagan administration to make sure that we knew what was going on and we knew who our enemy was. And for the past 40 years, we've been doing the same thing, providing historical and contemporary context for our movement partners to better determine their strategies and their goals, and to help bring about a multiracial, feminist, queer, pluralistic democracy. So find us at PRA Eyes Right on all social media and politicalresearch.org.
And seriously, if you've never actually been to the website, please check them out. The work is really, really good. The research is outstanding. I'm always really excited when I get to cite the research and the work that you're doing. So we wanted to talk about research and specifically some data that has come out of Pew recently, and a lot of people are talking about it. We've seen lots of different articles. And I want to actually just start with the one that I think made a lot of headlines initially, which was data saying that there are more people who identify as trans or non-binary than ever before. And specifically, I think the headline was that as we look into younger demographics, that is where we have seen the highest spike in more people saying, yes, this is how I see myself. So what went into the change? Because there's so much conversation about it and frankly, a lot of nonsense. Tell us about it.
I mean, I don't know that what I have to say is not nonsense, but I'll certainly say it anyway, because you brought me here. So now you're stuck with me. I think that having a possibility model for how you can live your life is what we know empirically, that having someone accepting in your life saves lives, right?
Mhm.
Saves LGBTQ youth's lives. That person can be a parent, that person can be a teacher. And we also know empirically that the quantitatively more accepting adults you have in your life, the more likely you are as a youth to thrive and become an LGBT adult, which is what we want. I love that sign, the protest sign. It's like, we don't want your cis kids to be trans. We want our trans kids to survive, right? And I think when you look at those kind of two phenomena across time, having a possibility model in your life, something that you can suddenly see yourself as thriving. Janet Mock and Laverne Cox made that possible 5-8 years ago, with that Time magazine cover and everything. And suddenly Black trans girls were like, oh my God, wait, I could be something. And that is enormous. So you combine the more possibility models, Elliot Page, people who have huge platforms, Alok, these are people who are representing types of transness and non-binariness that we didn't necessarily see in public life over the past, I would say, I'm going to be weird and say, I would say over like 400 years, because we have seen trans and non-binary people in public life previous to, maybe the white colonization of the Americas.
Right.
People had really cool roles and were priests and priestesses and soothsayers. So you have possibility models, but then you have adults in kids' lives who are affirming them. So of course they're going to thrive. We have so many queer kids right now who have parents who are, when the kid opens the door and invites a parent into the closet, is like, yes, I'm so excited. How can we thrive together? Let's reach out to PFLAG. Let's get some training and let's make sure that you become a trans or non-binary or queer adult. So I think those two things are important to the trend that's happening right now.
Yeah, I really appreciate that explanation because, I've heard so many people saying, oh, it's just a trend. And I'm like, it's not a trend. It's something that was always there, but I don't think that we necessarily had the space for everyone to vocalize it at the ages when they are vocalizing it now. I mean, the example that Liz and I were talking the other day, and I said, when I was young, if you wanted to meet somebody and you didn't know, you would go to the bookstore and like go stand in the lesbian books aisle at Powell's and like wait for somebody and see if anyone. That was it. But now you can go online and connect and like we can have these conversations. So thank goodness that it's not just about standing in the bookstore all day long.
That's really cool though. I mean, I should say, as a bisexual person and an agender person, we didn't have a bookstore aisle. So I really didn't have people who were bisexual, who were agender living, coming up. And that's one of the reasons why I am so vocally out, is because I want to be that possibility model for people who can see me and say, oh, there aren't enough books in the book aisle, but maybe I can write one. Maybe I can be one. And Heron is proof that, you can at least survive, if not thrive.
You're doing more than surviving, my friend. I mean, seriously, you even came in with the glamorous introduction. I mean, that's right. Thriving. That was thriving.
Thank you.
So, one of the interesting things in the Pew data that I saw was we saw that more people are saying that they are connected to somebody who's trans. So they know somebody who's trans, which typically and historically, we would look at something like contact theory and we would say, well, if you get to know somebody, it reduces bias. Chances are you'll become more accepting. And in some respects in this data, we are seeing levels of acceptance, such as the support for non-discrimination legislation. However, at the same time, we saw a decline in the number of people who said, your gender is really determined by the genitals that you were born with. And we have seen sort of a decrease in people who are sort of seeing gender identity as the core of what we're talking about. How do you explain this disconnect? Because I have to admit that when I looked at that data and I thought more people connected should mean there's higher understanding, and yet it seems like we're going backwards. What do you think is happening?
I think we have to still hold the complexity that these polls are not, they're imperfect tools. And I think I don't want to put too much stock in a single time period of dip.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if I saw a significant dip over time while there was still an increase in people knowing trans people, I think I would be concerned. And I'm certainly concerned about this. But I think that rather than looking at maybe a sociological problem, some stickiness there, I think what we're really seeing is the power of mis and disinformation and the lack of public education around gender identity. There is not a standardized sexual education curriculum starting from kindergarten up through 12th grade that talks about gender identity, that talks about sexual orientation, that talks about the biological complexities of human gender. We still have bio textbooks that say that there are two sexes, which is empirically false. I think that's the second time I've used the word empirical on this. I'm such a bougie jerk.
But I mean, the fact that you can actually say it because it is fact-based.
Yes. So that's what I think. I think that we're seeing this stickiness of misinformation and disinformation and the impact of prolonged attacks on comprehensive sexual education in the United States and abroad. So it makes sense that people don't understand the difference between sex and gender, for example. Right. It also makes sense that people don't really know how to use appropriate barrier contraceptive methods. And people don't understand the difference between, for example, Plan B and a chemical abortion, for example. You know, we're seeing many ripples of this attack on comprehensive sexual education across the United States. And again, I can't say that is the reason, but it has to be a reason. It has to be part of why people are not reaching a level of competence around the science around being trans and non-binary that we would hope that they had.
But what you're saying actually kind of feeds into the next thing that I found interesting in this particular survey. So people were asked, how did you make your decisions about these things? On what do you base your opinions? And the number one answer, shocking us all, was science. And yet the answers that people were often giving, to your point and to the point of empirical evidence, was the fact that the answers that they are giving are not aligned with science. They are not aligned with what we actually know. For example, the fact when we talk about assigned sex, there is more than male and female when we talk about sex assignments at birth, but just starting right there. So do you think, what is going on for people to actually say science is my primary reason and then to completely fly in the face of that? Is that because there has been such a successful infiltration of science with junk science, or is there something else that I'm missing?
As you were saying that, I didn't know that. So that's super interesting. As you were saying that, I was like, what do people think science is? Because science is a process, right? Science is a process of testing things, of thinking that something is true, testing it, finding out whether it is true or false, and then making sure that that test is replicable. So other people who aren't you can make it, and when the scientific community agrees on something, that's a huge idea.
Yeah.
That means that test has been replicated over and over and over again successfully, showing that this original scientist's hypothesis was true or false. Science is not igneous rocks, nitrogen in the atmosphere. Some people have vaginas and some people have penises. Those are just things that exist. We know about igneous rocks through science.
Right.
We can say that the atmosphere is full of nitrogen because we've tested it and it has proven true over and over again. And we can say that humans seem to have a sex and a gender identity. Both of the sex and the gender identity are spread across enormous spectrums, and that we are not bimodally gendered, that is, just men and just women, creatures. Because that doesn't exist, because nature is really, really sloppy and messy. But I think that might be it. People think science is the facts, but it's not. Science is the process.
Yeah.
Science is the process, and the process has been moving since the 1980s, people. Yeah. It's moved on. We have asked better questions and gotten better answers and been able to replicate them.
It's fascinating because, I saw another piece of research this week that said that fewer people are saying that they get their ideas about the world from the Bible. And I thought, what an interesting piece, a data point, because it seems like that in some ways less than ever based on what is going on around us, where we see so many legislative things very much being driven by somebody's religious beliefs, not necessarily everyone's and not necessarily a correct one, but somebody's. And I think seeing that and seeing that science point together, I think really does speak to the fact that people don't even understand what this conversation is. So one of the interesting things that I have noticed since this Pew research came out is there has been a lot of conversation about the way questions are asked in polling and the results that they yield because of the way those questions are asked. And even in this particular study, I have seen some conversations among different advocates and especially researchers saying that had questions been asked in different ways. So for example, when we talk about trans youth and healthcare around that, had the question been asked in a different way, we probably would have gotten different results. When you look at studies like this Pew research and some of the other stuff that's coming out, what are pollsters getting right in the way they are asking questions? And what questions either are we not asking, or how should we be asking some of these questions so we really get information that is useful to give us a clue for action?
I think that your question about like, how do we get information that's useful is really important. Questions, the only thing a question answers is what would that person think in response to that exact question. A question like, do you support trans healthcare for youth does not ask, do you love trans people? Do you agree with trans people thriving and justice for trans people? It only asks that exact question at that exact moment. This has always been, kind of like the problem with polling is it is a point in time, unless you do longitudinal studies, look across time and see what changed people's minds. But then because we're using science, we need to make sure we're using the same people all the time. Longitudinal studies are difficult to provide accurately. So Pew does the best that they possibly can, and they are the best at what they do. But at the end of the day, they're still restricted by their instrument. And the instrument is the questions that you're asking. Questions about LGBT people have been in flux since people began gathering information about LGBT people, especially questions around what labels do we use for people? How do we talk about people's bodies? How do we talk about people's transition histories? How do we talk about whom people fall in love with versus whom they're attracted to versus whom they have sexual contact with? Those are all important questions, especially around youth. Because you're not going to have youth that can say they had a boyfriend, but they can say they've been attracted to boys, right? And the touchstone the entire time that we have been having these questions, these conversations about questions is, what is the community saying right now? How can we go back to how the community talks about self? What are people leaning towards to make sure that our conversations are more rooted in justice? Versus just, versus just counting us, for example, like you've counted us, that's great. Unless we were part of it and we're going to help use that information and utilize that information too. So what? You counted us and now, there's a lot of us. We knew that already, like we could also say, we knew that public support for specific areas around trans lives was eroding because we're looking at the legislatures across the country. We're looking at the increase in interpersonal and, organized violence. And we're looking at an increase in state sponsored violence in places like Texas and Florida. So that doesn't super answer your question, but a poll question is extremely, extremely precise to the time and the person was asked to. And we just hope that when scientists build these studies, that trans scientists are part of the conversation, that trans movements and community leaders and grassroots folks are part of the conversation as well. So at least we can use this data for, I'm gesturing to this side of the screen because this is where the poll is up for me. We can use this data right here to help us too. We need this information, and we need it to be as useful as possible to us.
Yeah, as I was looking at some of the data, I was getting upset because a lot of it wasn't particularly good. And I thought, you have this reaction against it. And I think as bad as this is, it actually is useful because this is how people were feeling at a certain point. And whether I like the results or not, it needs to inform what comes next, which got me sort of thinking about, I think I sent myself into a little bit of a chicken or the egg situation. I was wondering if maybe you can help me out of it. I was looking at, or maybe not, or maybe you'll just go right down the rabbit hole with me. But as I was looking at some of the polling numbers, I was noticing that in a few cases, it seemed to me that we had been losing ground in terms of the progress that we had made, in terms of acceptance and support for certain things. Meanwhile, I look around and I look at the 300 plus pieces of legislation that we've had to deal with this year, the 300 plus pieces that we've had to do last year, most of which very specifically target trans and non-binary people. And it made me start wondering, are the declines in support that we are seeing in some of these polls a side effect of some of what is happening out there in the states? In other words, even a bill that is introduced and maybe not successful, are those negative campaigns that are introduced actually having a huge effect on the perceptions of people who maybe up until then didn't have a lot of an opinion? Or do you think there's something else, some other current going on that I'm missing?
I think there's a lot of currents going on, like with all of this. Certainly the state legislative action and just the bombardment from media, from right-wing media and mainstream media too, from people who were either seduced by mis and disinformation or hold these beliefs themselves and are suddenly exposed to having them. So I think that, state legislatures and the onslaught in the media are seriously impacting people's perceptions of queer people. I think it was Media Matters that showed that Fox News covered trans sports in 77 segments or something in 2021, compared with mainstream media, which were like 1 or 2 segments. Wow. So we cannot discount just the fire hose of misinformation coming from the right-wing media. And then we also can't forget that for 4 years, we were told through every single channel that trans people weren't worthy of protection, weren't worthy of health or justice or safety. And in fact, were, the chaff that got, knocked off the wheat for the Trump administration as he continues to have impacts on us through the judges and the justices that he successfully appointed to state and federal courts across the country. That work had impacts, and we're seeing the impacts. I'm looking at the poll right now about the bit you were talking about. In September 2017, 54% said that sex is determined at birth from looking at your genitals. And then in May 2022, 60% said that. That is certainly a significant increase, but to me, that is accountable through misinformation, through the media, and through just the onslaught from the Christian right and the Trump campaign. When you get told something every single day, and maybe you don't know a trans person, it's going to be difficult to find other sources of information that are telling you, no, trans people are real people who deserve to pee and go to school and play sports just like you do.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So we have a little bit of time left. And I think there are 2 things I still want to get into. The first one is, what information do we need? So when we look at sort of these big research projects, when we look at sort of these big public opinion things, are there questions that are not being asked that you think would be really helpful for us to understand more about?
Yeah, I mean, I have a dream that, I think my daughter's knocking on the door. I have a dream that we ask questions like, do you believe that trans people deserve to thrive? The answer would probably be yes, right? And then you can say things like, do you think that trans people deserve to use the bathroom when they need to use the bathroom? Because that's important for thriving.
Right.
We sometimes, we talk about priming and making sure that we're not placing people in a specific position mentally before they do these tests. But that's what media misinformation and the Trump administration and these anti-trans legislatures are doing all the time. They're priming us. Yep. They're giving us information, giving us sticky messages that we hear in other parts of our life too, as patriarchy and sexism and racism pervades so much of our life. We hear all the time that certain people don't deserve to be healthy and well and to live a life free from violence and access housing and have a job, use the bathroom. So it makes a lot of sense that these messages would be sticky too. They're part of the milieu, and we're hearing them constantly from the media and from these bad legislatures. So do trans people deserve to thrive? I would love that. You know, and now I'm thinking like people who say no, like
I was, as you asked the question, I'm like, would everyone say yes? And that's what actually scares me.
I hope so. You know, I think I don't want to be like the, you know, the one true trans man who like stands up here and says, here's the questions that we need to hear. But like, I would love to, you know, learn more about like what people think about their own gender and their own orientation too. Because if we talk about priming someone to think about themselves being in our community of people who have gender, that would change the conversation too. Yes. These non-discrimination protections, they protect all of us from being discriminated against based on our gender identity or our sexual orientation, including people who are cisgender and including people who are straight. There are also cisgender and straight people who are queer, people who are asexual, for example. But I would love a, hey, did you know that you have a gender? Hey, do you think that people should be protected from discrimination based on their gender, like you? You know, that'd be kind of cool.
I think it would only be cool if you could ask the questions exactly like that, just with like that.
Yep.
I would really love that. You know, it's interesting because I spend, in real life, I actually spend most of my time teaching. And it is fascinating to me when we start talking about gender identity and we literally have to say to people, and you also have a gender identity. I bet you've never thought about it. And it really is. And I'm not poking fun at this. It's this light bulb moment for a lot of people. And I can tell, oh, I have this too. This is actually my conversation too.
Yes.
And I don't know if we have done enough of that and that there probably needs to be more of that. This isn't a someone else conversation. This is also a you conversation too.
Yes. Everyone is gender nonconforming. Nobody is the ideal woman or the ideal man or the ideal non-binary person, although I am very close.
You really are. You really are.
But so patriarchy and gender roles and gender stereotypes and sexism sincerely do impact us all. The trans conversation and the abortion conversation and the sexism conversation are all the same conversation as the equal pay conversation, the same conversation as anti-Black racism, which impacts, you know, Black women who can never achieve that ideal woman status because of misogynoir, which is racism against Black women, and misogyny against Black women. Racism and misogyny together. All of these conversations are entangled. So yeah, let's get a Pew poll that's like, hey, did you know you have a race? Did you know you have a gender? What do you feel now about protections against discrimination on the basis of characteristics that we all have? Oh, Jean Marie, this is a very short aside. People who complain about losing sex-based rights because of trans people have a fundamental misunderstanding of what non-discrimination protections really do.
Yes.
There are no sex-based rights in the United States, but we do have rights to be free from discrimination based on our sex and our gender identity. They're not the same. I don't have a right to do something specifically because I'm non-binary. I can't just walk through the world and say, this is my non-binary store. Nobody who's not non-binary can come in. But I do have a right to go into a store and not be discriminated against because I'm non-binary. That's the right that I have. So I just wanted to throw that in there.
No, and I appreciate you saying that because I think, you know, as I've noticed that a lot of our conversation has been about how we set up questions, how we are having those conversations. And I think that is one of those flips. That is one of those things that I don't think people are exposed to. This is what this is really about. And when you frame it like that, suddenly you have these moments of you can actually see sort of the gears turning and people making these connections. I'm looking at the clock. We have to wrap up. I wish we had like another 30 minutes because I feel like we were just getting started once again.
I'll come back.
so much. You do have to come back. Please make sure that you come back so that we can do more poses together. And thank you so much for everything that you're doing. And thank you for being with us today.
My pleasure. Absolutely. And find me everywhere, please. I'm on at HERONG, Heron G on Twitter.
Thanks, Heron. I'll see you soon.
Okay.
Bye.
Good. Bye.
Well, everybody, another show wrapped up. We have a great one coming for you next week. You definitely don't want to miss it. I'm actually going to say your reading assignment today is please go to Political Research Associates website and look at some of the work, including Heron's Anti-LGBT Organizing 101, which is fascinating. As a little reminder, beyond that reading assignment, we are continuing to read with love at PFLAG. So if you would like to learn more about our program to replenish what is disappearing from library bookshelves, please visit us at pflag.org/readwithlove. We will be back next week with another show. As we remind you every week, run fast, laugh hard, and most of all, please, please, please be kind. If you need help, visit us at pflag.org. I'm Jean Marie Nevada. We will be back with another show. See you next week, everybody.